Welcome to Identified.
I don't fit in Oakland because I'm too white and I'm too in trouble. I don't fit in Brooklyn because I'm too Gentile seeming. And then my bar mitzvah finally happened and I was like, oh, great, I'm a man now, but I don't feel like that in either thing. And then the bad kids found me.
Right.
And then I found my second family. I found the people that even if it was a dysfunctional family, they accepted me as is. I fit. I wasn't a sore thumb anymore. And we kind of know how that ended. Like very quickly, I ended up in a lot of trouble and in rehab multiple times. And then I turned 16 and I was finally sober and I was like, well, back to the beginning, now what? And that's when I found all these people.
Hello, I'm Nabil Ayers, author, music executive, and host of Identified, the podcast that delves deep into the complex world of family and identity. In this episode, my guest is Moshe Kasher, a comedian, actor, and author who recently published his second book, Subculture Vulture, a memoir in 6 scenes. Moshe is one of those people who has lived several lives that pivot from growing up with his hippie mother, just like me, to summers with his orthodox Jewish father in Brooklyn. In our conversation, Moshe opens up about his winding path through diverse subcultures and how that shaped his comedic voice. He vividly recalls the transgressive comedy of Patrice O'Neal and Sarah Silverman that opened him to the possibilities of stand-up comedy. Moshe also shares how his childhood friend, Chelsea Peretti, ushered him into comedy by bringing him to open mic nights, launching the career he has today. With humor and candor, Moshe explores how he used comedy as a survival mechanism when he felt like an outsider in school. From performing comedic monologues to becoming an activist and author, Moshe has drawn from his multifaceted life to develop his authentic comedic style. As you will hear, these paths have impacted the way he defines family, a concept that has evolved since having a child of his own. Here's my conversation with Moshe.
My latest book, Subculture Vulture, it's a memoir, but it's kind of I did another memoir called Kasher in the Rye, the true tale of a white boy from Oakland who became a drug addict, criminal, mental patient, and then turned 16. That I wrote it 11 years ago. It was my Hello, This Is Me book.
Right, and you write your life story, and then you somehow write your second life story.
Well, yeah, it's funny. I remember I was at Comic-Con many years ago, and George R.R. Martin, your hero and mine, my father, my famous estranged father that I had to track down, that would be a big reveal. It's not really my father. Anyway, he was there. I run up to him and I say, oh my God, I'm such a big fan of your books. Your workload, I would say I'm not as big of a fan of, but I'm writing this memoir. It was about to come out. I'm writing this memoir.
Sorry, the first book is about to come out.
My first book was about to come out. Yeah. And I was like, I'd love to send it to you. You know how you do when you fanboy out a little bit.
Right,
I just thought, he writes, I write, I love you. And he just looked at me, started laughing. He goes, how are you even old enough to write a memoir? My first memoir ends literally at 16 years old.
Right, so you left yourself some time.
Well, that is the big question that was sort of raised is like, when I was 15, I wrote that book about, getting out of rehab for the last time.
Yeah.
And one of the big questions especially when you're young, but when you're in that addiction cycle period, is like, you have this framing of, oh no, now I'm sober, I'll never have anything to do again. And that idea is the product of a deeply diseased mind. That you can't even see how diseased the idea is. Because only a mind that only does drugs and drinks for fun would think, if I take those two elements out of my life, I will never be able to do anything again. It's only the mind that only does those two things.
So is it that you won't be able to do anything, or is that those are the things you did and taking them out means there is nothing?
Yes, I think it's both. It's like you're so blurry when you're in an addictive cycle, you're so blurry that getting high and getting fucked up, it feels like, because it is the only thing that you do, it feels like the only thing that is to be done.
Right.
And so like the second book is really this big question about, okay, I took those two things that felt like the totality of experience out. And then I had to ask myself, like, what's next?
Right.
And it seemed at the beginning of asking that question like the answer was nothing. And as I got older and had become an adult, I now look back and say, wow, it was everything. Right? It was all of the things that I cobbled together to create an actual real life. In reality, like my life at the end of that book had become and I was so young. but it had become so teeny. And it had become so, in AA, there's this admonishment to live one day at a time. And I always said, like, there is no entity, there is no demographic that lives more truly one day at a time than the active drug addict and alcoholic.
Right.
It's not the person in recovery. When you are a drug addict, alcoholic, your mission is clear.
The short term.
Yes,
Right.
it's short term. It's wake up in the morning, find enough money, or find a hustle,
Right.
steal something, sell something, do something, get high. That is it. That is truly one foot in front of the other. And so the second book was all about, like, okay, all that's gone. Like, I've got all this unlimited freedom and it feels like I have no options. Let me begin. And so I began. And then my life, like, just exploded into this search. I was realizing, going through that search and going through that journey, what I was doing and what subculture, because that's what the book is about. The second book is really about
Subculture Vulture.
Yeah, it's called Subculture Vulture, and it's really about these 6 universes that I spent my life in. These 6 subcultures, some of which are classic kind of like 90s kid subcultures, like the rave scene and Burning Man and stand-up. Those are like actual true subcultures in a way. And some of them are like less traditional. They're more elemental. They're more who I am in my DNA or in my actual culture. Deafness and sign language interpreting and Hasidic Judaism and the Jewish community. But what I am realizing, and because I've been thinking about this so much lately because of the book, and I think if the book has a thesis at all, it's that subculture was this fundamental building block of our identities, people our age. In the 90s, pre-advent of the internet,
Right.
Your journey as a person was to, if you were lucky and you were interesting, was to stumble into some stream that pulled you into a world.
Right. Some association with some like-minded group of people that did something that seemed cool.
Exactly.
Right? Yeah.
And like my first subculture was just the bad kids, you know, and that's what the whole first book is about.
Right.
And it wasn't because I was like, ooh, look, bad kids, I'm a bad kid, I want to be a bad kid. It was, I am this sort of sore thumb, lonely because of my real biological, actual family circumstances. Here is this group that is inviting me in.
Right.
And then I found myself downstream, no paddle, no boat, no life preserver, going to rehab when I was 15. But that didn't matter because you always hear that from gang members. This is my family.
Right, right.
And so I've been thinking about that question in regards to subculture a lot because of all of these more sort of classic subcultures, the rave thing in particular, but Burning Man definitely, and comedy to some extent, and Judaism in a kind of more macro way, and deafness. These are places where you eke out these non-biological families.
Right.
Subculture does that for you. It creates these like little sub-families where you're part of the thing that happens in human development is, do you have kids?
No.
I recommend it. You can borrow mine.
Talking about it.
Yeah. My wife's therapist once said, your job as a parent is they come out of you, you begin training them to leave you forever.
Right.
You know, that's like the training.
Trying to build a person that's capable of doing that in a good way, right?
Exactly. It's this kind of heartbreaking, beautiful cycle where you go, everything I'm doing is trying to lace this person with the building blocks to eventually say, fuck you, and leave. And when you're a teenager, there's this split that happens where all of a sudden the people that you stumble into become more important to you than your real family. Now, ideally, if you're raised well, you'll double back. So I've been thinking about family, non-traditional, non-biological family in regard to these subcultures that I found because each of them gave me this little element of thing, this familial feeling that I now have recobbled together and put into the ethics that I'm trying to instill in my daughter.
Right.
Like,
Pass on.
Yeah, like she wears glow sticks, candy bracelets, and we listen to David Guetta when we can.
How old is she?
No, this isn't true. She is 5. She's 5.
So she doesn't have a choice, but she does those things.
The truth is she does not. You know, I started writing the rave chapter was the first chapter that I wrote in the new book, and I was listening to dance music the whole time to kind of get in the zone or whatever. Were you listening to jazz while you wrote your book?
You know, my thing with music, I've been asked this question so many times and thought about it so many times because it encompasses my entire life. And so my trick, I figured out pretty early, was to put on whatever I would have been listening to at the time to get into that time period. So
you would put on the music of the time that you were writing about.
Yeah.
The
music I would have been listening to. So when I was writing the stuff about being a kid, I was writing about Kiss.
That's
and I was
great.
listening to Kiss. And earlier, you know, so it was really And with streaming, I mean, it was such an easy thing to do, and it's such a fun journey, and it really brought back memories in a really cool way.
That is great. I did the same thing. The rave chapter, I was a DJ and a rave promoter and an ecstasy dealer in this sober ecstasy dealer, one of the few. Right. Kind of a pioneer of
don't get high on your own supply.
Well, it was a true don't get high on your own supply. It was go to an NA meeting to avoid getting high on your own supply.
Wow.
It was very, very cognitively dissonant.
Yeah.
I would go to these raves. Did you ever go to raves?
No.
Well, raves are interesting.
Total guitar guy.
Yeah, raves are interesting. The drug thing at raves is interesting because 90, maybe 80% of, raves are drugs. Yeah. We all know this. Yeah. This is not new information.
Right, whenever it's like, how do these people just stay up all night dancing?
Well, I did it, and I did it sober.
Really?
But the drug thing at raves is, I think it's less so now, but certainly at the time, it was like you did one drug. Right. You did ecstasy. You did MDMA, and you did 85 to 90% of the drug sales at a rave would occur within the first hour of the party.
Right.
It's literally, there's a phalange of, do you ever watch Star Trek The Next Generation?
Yeah,
where they're doing the pain stick to Worf as he's becoming a man? As we both probably related to that because it felt like our childhoods. That's what getting ecstasy is at a rave. It's like you walk in, there's like an open air market of vendors all saying the same thing, E. I guess now they would say Molly. I think the nomenclature has changed.
Different terminology.
But you're walking, and it was X before that, and you're walking in and you buy the drugs, and then pretty much the rest of the drug sales are either, for the rest of the night, are either people that have built up a tolerance and they were doubling back for pill number 2, or people who got ripped off, or people who get there late. So what I would do is I would go and I would stand in the gauntlet, I would sell ecstasy, and invariably somebody that I knew from recovery would be walking in because it was the entrance to the rave. And so I would be like, I'm an active, sober guy. I'm young, I'm 16. And that's a big part of it is that I was like, I wanted to be normal, normal, like a drug dealer at a rave, kind of a normal childhood. Totally, but I just wanted to be like a cool kid doing cool kid stuff but I was also fresh out of rehab and also kind of recognized that I needed to stay sober in some abstract way. Yeah. So invariably it would be me at the front going, Egads, good to see you, brother, from the Tuesday night men's meeting. What a wonderful evening. Have fun in the rave. So that was sort of, I would say, that's me at 16. Yeah. All of this chaos does come from real weirdness of my biological family, which I'm sure
I want to get into that. I'm curious. I especially connected with just the simple term I heard you use in an interview about your hippie mom, which I have a hippie mom. I'm a little older than you, but 70s. It's a specific time. How did your mother meet your father?
Well, my mom and dad, I always say when I start talking about my family, it feels like everything's going to be a nerd reference, just so you know. Okay. Feels like, when Bilbo Baggins goes into the spider lair and all of a sudden it's like these like cobwebs and there's it always, like anytime I open a little door, everything is so complicated and sticky all the way down. But my parents, my mother's not just a hippie. She's a deaf woman. Right. And so is my father. My father's a deaf man. Right. They were both deaf, are both deaf. Well, my dad's no longer deaf. My dad's in heaven, and we all know that deaf people can hear in heaven. Right. I don't know if you know that, but that's breaking news.
Comes later.
That's book 3, How the Deaf Hear in Heaven. Yeah. So my mom and dad met at some kind of World Games for the Deaf thing. And I really need to re-examine that. As a person that's written a memoir, I'm sure you relate to this, like memory is, especially around family lore, is so weird because you encounter these memories and you go, this barely makes sense.
Totally.
My dad was not an athlete. Like I always picture,
why were they there? Yeah.
Why are they at the World Games for the Deaf? I picture my dad like putting gymnast chalk on his hand. My dad,
you create memories that don't exist, which I wondered a lot writing a book. Was really like, I think I remember this. I'm going to tell this story, but maybe I just remember the way my mother told it to me. Who knows if I was even there? I don't, that all that stuff.
Well, I also have a brother, and he was raised directly with me, and sometimes, we will have the same memory, but the interpretation of it is so wildly different.
Yes.
I mean,
and my mother and her brother, same thing. Yeah.
So anyway, my parents met at the World Games for the Deaf, and my mom, the Godfather, the Thunderbolt, when he sees the Apollonia in Sicily, and he's just like, that's the one. Actually, it sounds like what your mom did.
Similar to mine, right.
Yeah. My mom said...
hippie mom said...
Yes,
that's the person.
Him. And she left a note. We're from Oakland, and she left a note to my grandmother in Oakland saying, I've moved to New York, I'll be okay, and was out. And moved to New York and had my brother, and then 3 years later had me, and then 9 months after that, said that they were going on a vacation to go see my grandma back in Oakland, and we never came back. And
So she left your father and took both kids.
she left my father and took both kids. And in fact, I have this box. When my dad died, I got this big box of his things, which is a thing that happens when you have a person that dies. You get these boxes of sometimes trash, sometimes treasure. There's just stuff. And I opened this calendar, and it was a calendar that my father had then. It was really intense. There was a mark of B and the boys leave for Oakland. And then there were X's counting down the days for our return. And when the X's stopped, that's when my life in Oakland began. And my dad, I guess, just...
That's when he gave up and realized
they're not coming back. Yeah.
How many X's were there?
That's a good question.
Yeah.
I mean, it filled a couple of columns, and I think probably he got a call saying, this is it.
I'm curious, you're talking about subcultures and sort of fitting in with these different groups and how they kind of become families. How did comedy represent that for you? And is it related? I might be taking a stretch with this, but addiction and substance abuse is a thing. And you talk about when that was missing, what was left or what there was to do. And did comedy in a way replace that?
Well,
or was it born from that?
90% of my life was in Oakland public schools. And in the 80s and 90s in Oakland public schools, and I think it's a little different now because of gentrification, but at the time it was like 70% black, probably 25% everything else, Latino, Asian, everything else, and then maybe 5% white kids. And so you very quickly do the math that you are, and as I say in the first book, like at that time, black was not just, the black kids were, because of how high a percentage they were the Letterman. Right. They were the quarterback. They were the prom king and queen.
You're the minority.
They were aspirational in a way. So you go like, you realize very quickly, if I'm gonna be white in this world, I have like a few choices. I can be a nerd. You know, I can be a picked upon nerd. Right. I can be a white kid who tries to be black, or I can be like a hybrid, which is a bad boy. Like I can be one of the white kids at the back of the school, like the fuck ups.
Right. Smoking cigarettes or worse. Right?
That group. And so those are the people that found me, was the fuck ups. You quickly realize like you could like keep your head down and be an anonymous sort of white boy that nobody paid attention to, except to maybe once in a while, like knock the nachos out of your hand. Or you can kind of like disassociate from the social stream and like become this other kind. But specifically with comedy, I started to realize like, okay, I can become funny. And I can subvert sort of power dynamics in that particular way. So if we're talking about like elemental, how did I elementally start to use comedy? I would say 100% it is being a white boy in Oakland public schools and just trying to find a way to like be noticed, to like doggy paddle at the top of the social stream. Right. If I could be bad, if I could fuck things up, you know, I started very early writing these stories. In fourth grade, I would write these like stories of all the characters in my class, like these comedic stories, you know, where they were, and I would read them in front of the class and everybody would kind of like them. And I got to de-anonymize myself through those stories. Yep. So there's that for sure. Right. In fact, my fourth grade teacher saw the potential in me and he pulled me out and said, I want you to write the school play. And so me and this other kid who I do not think was dramatically gifted, but just wasn't as troubled as me, wrote the school play together. A musical about the search for the westward expansion for the gold rush. It was called Westward Ho. And I also got the starring role. But I was
because
also...
you wrote it.
Because I wrote it. But then I also was I was such a fuck up, even that young, that he got Mr. Fong. He got so mad at me that he demoted me to Indian number 2. I had been the star. I had been the star of the show that I wrote. And
Indian
then I got
number
demoted.
2.
Indian number 2.
A role that I'm sure the play still exists, but the role probably does not.
Dude, I track it down. Yeah. Apparently it's in a box somewhere in one of the kids' fathers still has a copy of it, Westward Ho. I do remember my line. We are friends. We are here to help you. See, this is the kind of dialogue that I was working with at the time. Like the fact that they couldn't see that it was like a young Aaron Sorkin coming up through the ranks. Yeah. We are friends. We are here to help you. Here, take these berries.
Wow.
Did you feel that?
I felt it. I mean, it's not funny yet, but it's strong.
No, but you know what it is it's, I would say, historically accurate. Right. You know, I would say that the Native community generally was very happy to see.
Out berries.
They had berries. They were happy to see the pioneers' arrival. Everything was very good. And they were friends, and they were here to help them, when you think of it.
And it all worked out great.
So that's sort of where comedy kind of proto starts.
Right.
With using that survival technique, I very quickly started getting into all kinds of trouble in class. And my mom, her thing was like, She had escaped my father through therapy. Therapy to me was the religion of the West Coast. Therapy was the ultimate authority. It was it was our God. And when I started to get into trouble in school, my mother shunted me down. There's a school to prison pipeline.
Yeah.
This was a school to mental health pipeline that my mom shunted me down. So the minute I started displaying like anything off, I started going to therapy when I was 4.
Wow.
I was in therapy when I was 4, and by the time I was 15, I was in therapy, not to brag, 8 times a week. 8 sessions
Every
a week.
day, twice one day.
That's right. I was in rehab, outpatient rehab 5 days a week. This is, now I'm like more like 13, 14 years old. Rehab 5 days a week, and then family therapy, group therapy, and individual therapy.
Wow.
So that's sort of where I was at.
And at a time when even the fact that your mother was in therapy, my mother was in therapy when I was in high school in the 80s. And I remember thinking like, this is really weird. Nobody does this. Like, it was not what it is now to be in therapy.
100%.
Even for your mom, especially for you as a kid, but even for a parent.
I was at a dinner party this Friday, and literally every single person started busting out anecdotes about what their therapist said. Listen, to be fair,
really
it was a Shabbat dinner, so everybody was Jewish, so it's not that weird.
Right.
But it was like 100%. Like, I was in therapy way before it was, especially at that age, not stigmatized. So all that stuff started happening. And then I got sent to like special ed classes, and I started getting diagnosed with learning disabilities and ADHD and all of these psychological disorders. And then, I don't fit in Oakland because I'm too white and I'm too in trouble. I don't fit in Brooklyn because I'm too Gentile seeming. And then my bar mitzvah finally happened, and I was like, oh, great, I'm a man now, but I don't feel like that in either thing. And then the bad kids found me.
Right.
And then I found my second family. I found the people that, even if it was a dysfunctional family, they accepted me as is. I fit. I wasn't a sore thumb anymore. And we kind of know how that ended. Like, very quickly, I ended up in a lot of trouble and in rehab multiple times. And then I turned 16, and I was finally sober, and I was like, well, back to the beginning. Now what? And that's when I found all these people.
Right.
I flunked out of 9th grade like 3 times. I just kept going, just kept flunking, and it was just very clear this wasn't going to happen. And then I got sober, and I took the high school equivalency test, and I ended up going to community college in Oakland and starting to like recobble this life. As I'm doing all these things, as I'm throwing raves, and as I'm starting to go to Burning Man and starting to figure all these like things out that I like socially, I was also trying to like cobble together this identity of like who I'm going to be. And in school and college, I discovered like theater. As we know, I got my start in the theater in 4th grade.
Mm-hmm, right. Writing and acting.
Writing and acting, kind of an auteur. But I kind of got back into it in college, and I started studying playwriting, and I started studying acting, and I couldn't decide, like, do I want to be a playwright? Do I want to be an actor? Do I want to, and I was also, maybe I'm going to be an academic. I was just all over the place. I took a trip to New York one summer, and my friend Chelsea Peretti, who I'd grown up with, who went to school with me, very popular, hilarious stand-up and actress, she had started doing stand-up. And I had been like, I wanted to be like this sort of Eric Bogosian kind of Spalding Gray guy, where I stand on a stage. I used to write these like long form monologues, and one of which was a friend of mine got diagnosed with HIV, and he was like one of my best friends growing up. And I wrote this monologue about a young person finding out that they have HIV. And that was my first published piece, was that one of the drama teachers that I worked with in college was like, read it and was like, are you okay? And published it in this thing called More Monologues by Men for Men Volume 2. It is so dramatically over the top and so not my story to tell that if it were discovered, it's available on Amazon right now, it would probably destroy me. So that's sort of where I was at. I was like, I'm going to be like a thunderclap of dramatism, but also I'm funny, and also I just was sort of all over the place. Right. And then Chelsea took me to an open mic in New York, and I saw Patrice O'Neill, and I saw Sarah Silverman. I remember sitting in that show, I was like astounded. They were so transgressive. And this is at a time when this is before comedy had become a kind of polarized ideological warfare about like what's good and what isn't good to say. We weren't there yet.
Right.
So it was like funny is all that matters.
Right.
And I remember Patrice, you know Patrice O'Neill?
I don't, no.
You should look him up. One of the funniest and truly most, offensive and just, I mean, I used to call him, he was like a philosopher of piece of shitness. He was like, IQ was probably in the 200s.
Right.
And the things he was talking about were vile.
Base level.
Oh,
Yeah.
just vile. And I remember him making fun of Michael J. Fox's Parkinson's disease. And it's not that I was like, oh, this is a topic I've always wanted to discuss. It was more like, I can't believe it's possible to make jokes about this.
Right. So the bad kid in you was attracted to all of this, right?
Yeah. And it was like, whoa, it like thunderstruck me. Like, and Sarah Silverman was extremely edgy. I remember some of the jokes she was making, and it was just, I couldn't wrap my brain around it.
Right.
I never thought of comedy for its own sake. In these long monologues I was trying to write, it was like comedy to get to reveal the HIV diagnosis or whatever. And this was like, it's comedy for comedy. And then the next night I went to another show with Chelsea that she was on. This time she was on it. And this was like very playful and much softer and much kinder. But she was performing, and she was like, me. She had gone to Oakland public schools, and I'd grown up with her, and she was a human being, as opposed to these like demigods that I'd witnessed the night before. I was like, that's a human being doing it, a person like me. And I said, wow, like she can do it. And she was good.
Right.
And I go, if she can do it, maybe I could try doing it. And so I told her, this was in June. I said, June of 2002, I think. I said, if you come to Oakland this summer, because I knew she was coming to see her family, I will have written 5 minutes of material, and I want to try this. And will you take me to an open mic? And she would, and she did, and I did, and that is how I started.
Amazing.
Yeah.
So once you were actually there and saw it and witnessed it and felt it, that was the connection.
Well, that's sort of how I see a lot of this stuff, is it's like this pinball, like just random. I mean, that is the way all life works, is that you look back and you see a pattern, but while you're in it, it is random.
Right. Or it feels random, at least. Yeah.
If I hadn't gone to New York that summer.
Right.
If I hadn't, and I wasn't supposed to be in New York that summer. I was at a semester abroad. I was in Israel at a semester abroad, and they shut the program down early because this was the time of the second intifada. So that was why my semester ended, and I ended up coming to New York. If I hadn't had that program canceled, if I hadn't gone to New York, if I hadn't looked up Chelsea, I wouldn't have the career I have. The daughter that I talked to you, I'm married to a comedian.
Right.
The daughter I talked to you about, trying to lace her with this sort of lessons that I learned from all these things, she wouldn't exist.
Right.
It'd be some other person. Natasha would be married to some other guy and have some different kid, and I would be probably a social worker in Oakland still. We wouldn't be having this conversation.
Yeah, right. The butterfly flaps its wings or whatever, right?
Yeah.
The thing that I think is interesting, I've had this conversation a lot with people, and I agree, and I can say the same thing about all the things in my life. The takeaway from that is universally, and my life would be so much worse if these things hadn't happened. It's never,
that's really,
wow, think who I might have married, or think who I might be sitting next to on the couch right now that's cooler than this dude. Or like, it's never there. It's always interesting. It's always from a point of, this is as good as it could have been, and I'm so glad this happened.
Well, that's fascinating. And it's really beautiful, because there's like this idea in AA that you're like, it's almost a battle cry that you'll hear people say, like, I don't have any regrets. I don't regret the mistakes I made, because the mistakes I made put me in the position to arrive here and get this life, blah, blah, blah.
Totally.
Like, okay, yes, it is a position of privilege, because I'm sure there's plenty of people out there that are like, another life? A butterfly effect with another life? My kingdom for another life. But there is something really beautiful about that. Like I said, like, you look back and you see the pattern, but at the time, it just feels like the journey you're on. Like, it's also nice that you look back on the pattern and it's become the kind of quilt that is your beautiful life. Like, it's not that, we all know that we're also wrong, right? Like, if we were in the other life, we would look at any other life that we'd been granted as insufficient. There's a beauty to the idea that you look back on your life and you go, this is what it was supposed to be. Perfect is the wrong word. But this was the beauty.
What it's supposed to be.
And so if you're a God believer, then you go, oh, God created this like perfect path for me. And if you're not, that's almost more beautiful. That randomness and chaos created this path for me.
Or you created it.
Or you, yeah.
Yeah. You've lived many lives.
I've lived at least 6.
Yeah, right.
Those are the ones in the book.
Those
but yes.
6 chapters. What is family to you?
This strange thing happens when you have a child, which is the only righteous way to live a life. And if you decide not to do that, then you are not living a righteous or good or wholesome or, no, I'm just kidding. But it is inescapable. that when you have a family, there's this reconstruction of what family means to you. The focus all of a sudden goes into this different direction where the relationship stops being about what you can get for your personal development to build you into a human being. How do I create this life? I take the things that my parents gave me, and then I take the things that I stumble into on the way in order to build up this artifice, this structure of selfness. And then all of a sudden you have a kid and you start to realize, like, I'm taking all of these coins that I have collected on the path, and now I'm going to try to pour them into this person, and then they're going to grab their own weird pathways.
The cycle.
Yeah. And so to me now, what family means to me is like, I think that I want to take the beauty of the things that this really is, I think, my new book is really a love letter to all of these communities, because all of them have given me these powerful building blocks of these aren't just worlds I've lived in, they are worlds that I've borrowed from to create myself. And I want to give my kid the beautiful parts of each one of those communities has great ugliness in them. I don't know if deafness has great ugliness in it, but everything else, I would say, there is great ugliness in the deaf world, and that's, it's about oppression, right? So yeah, even that. I want to strip away the ugly parts, or the parts that seem silly. Obviously, raves can seem really ridiculous when you talk about it as this is one of the foundational universes that created who I am, but there's beauty in it, this idea that dancing is a value in and of itself. There's some quote, I don't remember who it is, if I can't dance in your revolution, I want no part of it. Right. Anyway, so that's what family is to me now, is as a grown man and a person that's has a family of my own, is I want to pour these values into my kid so she can take those values and decide for herself which one of them still holds value for her as she adds sort of fruit from her own path into it and can create this structure of self.
Thanks for tuning in. Please consider subscribing to Identified wherever you get your podcasts so you don't miss an episode. And be sure to check out Identified on YouTube and identifiedpod.com, where you can watch videos from our interviews. Our executive producer is Kieron Banerji, and the show is produced by Palm Tree Island. The music for Identified is by Noella and Patricia Brennan. I'm Nabil Ayers. Thanks for tuning in.